Hey, this video contains spoilers for all of A Song of Ice and Fire, Game of Thrones, but not really House of the Dragon. You have been warned. Have you been waiting for the... I can't do that anymore. My soul died a long time ago. Yeah, I'm still waiting for the book, and so are you. It's been 13 long years since author George R. R. Martin began work on The Winds of Winter, aka TWOW, the latest sequel in his epic Cat in the Hat series. Or A Song of Ice and Fire, the books behind HBO's golden hit Game of Thrones. And while waiting for a new book, everybody's still worshipping that golden calf, I see. Except now that calf has a new look. Hey TWOW, if you're getting jealous of the television series making a comeback, don't you worry about Game of Thrones. The new CEO of HBO's parent company, Warner Brothers Discovery, David Zaslav, and master of attempting to dig the failing liquor chain out of $53 billion in debt, is gonna find new and exciting ways to try and milk this franchise.
Coming next July on the new Discovery HBO streaming service, Max. It's Shark Week, but with HBO. Watch your favorite HBO shows, but with sharks.
Jon, you've never been a bastard. You're Aegon Targaryen, true heir to the Iron Throne.
Danny, we have to talk, Danny.
I am a shark, Jon.
I know, Danny. Listen,
Jon, I am a f***ing shark. What the f***?
Well, that was weird. Off and on, people have suggested to me over the past 4 years to do an update on TWOW. I mean, sure, George has given us updates, and he's gotten a lot done, and yeah, I'm happy for him, but how was I supposed to make an analysis of this? George tweeted in 2021, I wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages. I still have hundreds of more pages to write. You ask me where he's at, I don't know. Chuck E. Cheese? But now, I think, for the first time ever, we can fairly accurately predict all major things about the Winds of Winter that you want to know. And yes, by the end of this video, you will know and understand when the Winds of Winter is on pace to finally release. And I'm not saying this in what I think is a bad, stupid way. Like, I know people are gonna come head walls and spikes if I can't back that up. Do you want me to back it up immediately? I'd love to just break out the TWOW release date calculator now and we could jam. But look at this thing. Almost all y'all have no idea what is going on here, no idea where the data is coming from, or what it is doing, or why it is doing it. And if you don't know all that, you're not gonna trust it. And anyone actually, hopefully bringing a good prediction to this fandom is guaranteed a trust problem, because this fandom is a mortuary of bad failed TWOW predictions over the years. 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018, what are we doing? Luckily, after all of this disappointment, as a fandom we've grown and learned not to get too excited when some new information... Never mind. And it's not just this topic, it's topic after topic after topic. 2024 announcement, 2024, it's coming out over and over and over. Hopefully at the end of this, you guys get a better idea of when it's gonna come out. I just wanna say, I'm not here to ruin your optimism, I'm here to destroy your happiness. Okay, but why am I so sure right now that we can figure out when the Winds of Winter is going to come out? Well, because before, when people were performing these statistical analyses, they were never going to be able to get a good answer, because the right data that they needed was simply not available. I mean, it's like people were trying to figure out where somebody was driving in their car, but they didn't know their destination. They didn't know where they were at. They didn't know how fast they were driving. If you don't know any of those things, you're gonna end up in Timbuktu. 538 took a look at this back in 2014 and said, quote, "This has been an exercise in the limits of statistical analysis. The stats tell us essentially nothing." So what's changed since then? Well, let's look at our list of things. What exactly are we looking for? You want to know the days that it's going to take to finish the Winds of Winter. So what goes into this? In the denominator, we need to know George's writing speed, how many pages he has written on average per day. Then up here in the numerator, we need two things. We need to know, one, where is he currently at? Like, how many pages does he have written so far? And lastly, but just as important, is how big is the Winds of Winter going to be overall? And altogether, this gives you the formula for figuring out when the Winds of Winter is going to come out. Simples. So we got this here. What do we know? Well, luckily, in the past couple of years, George R. R. Martin has provided us with 2 of these pieces of information. In 2022, he went on a bit of an information spree, slowly doling out the goods throughout that year to let us know where he was at. And knowing that value, and knowing when he started writing The Winds of Winter, we can compute his average writing speed over that period of time. That gives us 2 of the variables in this equation. So what about the third? Well, this one is where I think most of the people trying to make the Winds of Winter predictions end up falling flat on their face. Because this variable is just as important as the others, and I don't know without any good readily available data what y'all so-called predictors are plugging in here. Cause I won't settle for opinions, and I don't want any guesses. I don't care how many French dragon cakes, or Days of Westeros, or Spanish translators, last night's Ian McKinley interviews, website renewals, Worldcon 2020s, or Theodore Roosevelt quotes you can dream up. I have been to the top of the mountain, and I have seen the bad, and it sucked. I want only good data and hard facts. And so for the longest time, I thought figuring out how long the Winds of Winter was eventually going to be was basically impossible. It's always gonna be a guess. And if he doesn't know, how the hecky sack are we supposed to know? I mean, I did that thing 5 years ago, trying to figure out how short you could make the Winds of Winter overall, basically guessing at how many chapters you needed per character to fit them into the book. That's fine if you're having a yes or no answer, but if you're trying to predict the length of the overall book, guesses aren't good enough. You need actually something grounded with some sort of tentpole in reality. And we didn't have that. Didn't. Until a user on Reddit, while not looking for it and not noticing it, accidentally discovered a way to figure out how long the Winds of Winter is actually going to be. Like for reals. It is going to take some math and deduction to dig into that, break it all apart, and pull out what we need. And we're not going to get there in this video for a while, so just hang on to it. But it is possible. And knowing these, all 3 variables to our equation, we will be able to compute when the Winds of Winter is actually going to come out. Is it going to be the exact day it comes out? Probably not. But is it going to be actually based in data that's not hindered with biases that gives us a realistic projection of when it's going to come out? Yeah, I think so. And so to solve our equation, we need to go back to the important A Song of Ice and Fire year of 2022 to find out what is fact and what is not, and really drill deeply into that Winds of Winter bedrock. This might not be the most solid bedrock, but if you were to ask me, would I build a bridge on this information? Absolutely! So what did George actually say? Well, strap in and get ready to ride the winds of winter, you special Tacomaneros, because we're going on a 2022 TWOW Recap. It all started back on April 29th of 2022 in a blog post titled Random Bits of This and That. It was just a couple of sentences, but it said a lot about the Winds of Winter. Everybody please welcome back to the program, George R. R. Martin. It's been a while since I've done this.
The Winds of Winter is going to be a big book. The way it's going, it could be bigger than A Storm of Swords or A Dance with Dragons, the longest books in the series to date. I do usually cut and trim once I finish, but I need to finish first.
So let's go ahead and add this guy to our little handy-dandy chart here to keep these things straight, because they sort of change with phases of the moon and all that. Things went quiet for May until George made a surprising guest appearance on an A Song of Ice and Fire podcast. So I'm going to play an excerpt of about 2 minutes here from the 488th episode of Game of Owns. It's so long because I want you to pay very close attention to what George says, because besides the very specific The Winds of Winter update at the end, there's something inside of here that's very interesting that he says that I don't think anybody else has picked up on. And we'll come back to that in a little bit.
If I get in a groove on a particular character, I may write 2-3 chapters about that character and then go back and write something else. So I will say that there's a lot of Tyrion in this book, and I think I'm close to finishing the Tyrion arc in Winds of Winter. I think this chapter and maybe one further chapter, and I won't be done with the book, but I'll be done with Tyrion's role in this particular book. And then I'll have to focus on another character. Some of whom are also close, some of whom are Not at all close. So, and then hopefully it all fits together. And I don't know. I do a lot of rewriting on these, And, when I first sold the trilogy, it was supposed to be a trilogy in the beginning, that fell apart very quickly. I mean, I was writing Game of Thrones and I was writing it. And, at a certain point I said, I have like 1,200 pages here and I'm not even close on some of these characters. I better reorganize that. And then, okay, it's a 4-book trilogy.
In that energy, do you think that it might go beyond 7? Could you go beyond 7 books?
Well, in a sense, it already has with Dunk and Egg and Fire and Blood
the key
and all
clutch.
of that. The main Ice and Fire.
Yeah.
I hope not. I hope not. I mean, honestly, these are big books.
Yeah.
It is conceivable, and I will not know. This is not a definite answer, okay, but that Winds of Winter might be a bigger book than either Storm of Swords or Dance with Dragons, which are the 2 biggest books.
Mm.
And I'm not talking 10 pages bigger. I'm talking 300 pages bigger or something like that.
So we know now that George thinks he might need 1,800 or so manuscript pages to finish The Winds of Winter, and Tyrion's chapters are very close to being finished. The next update came in October 25th when George flew out to New York City to meet with his publishers and also had a guest appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Now, since The Late Show is owned by CBS, I'm not even going to fly close to that copyright Eye of Sauron, so I am going to read it from the transcript. Stephen S., legally, I have to ask you, how are things going with Winds of Winter? A legal requirement of me. I have a contract that says I have to ask George R. R. Martin when he comes on.
I am making progress with the Winds of Winter, but it is still not done yet. But have I gotten...
How much are we talking? How much farther,
Well, I think it's going to be a very big book. The biggest books so far were the 3rd volume, Storm of Swords, and the 5th, A Dance with Dragons. Both were about 1,500 pages. This one is going to be bigger than either of that, and I think I'm about 3/4 of the way done. I'm done with some of the character, the characters all interweave, so I actually have finished with a couple of the characters. I have their whole story, but not others, so I have to finish all that weaving, but it is still going to take me a while.
So 10 years to go, 75% of the way through. Means that about...
That's depressing.
Yes, okay, alright. 3 more years. So George didn't say the 300 pages thing again, but he did say for the first time an actual progress update, that he is 3/4 of the way done. And just a couple of days later, Random House would put up a video with an interview of George where he discussed some things from The Winds of Winter. Once again, gonna read from the transcript.
It's the same update I've been giving for a long time. I continue to work on it. It continues to get longer and longer. I mean, I was working on it the day before I flew back here for 3 or 4 days. I was rereading some chapters that I'd written earlier, and I didn't like them well enough. And, so I kind of ripped them apart and rewrote them. It's a big book. I've said that before. It's a challenging book. It's probably gonna be a larger book than any of the previous volumes in the series. Dance with Dragons and Storm of Swords are the 2 largest books in the series. They were both about 1,500 manuscript pages. I think this one is going to be longer than that by the time I'm finished with it, and I think I'm about 3/4 of the way done? Maybe? But that's not 100% done, so I have to continue to work on it. And of course, then there's the issue here, my friends at Random House, when I deliver this monstrous book that will be as big as this dragon, are going to try and make me cut it in 2. Or are they going to do something other horrible to me? No! We'll find out about that, but first I have to finish it. I have to get it all done, and I've given up making predictions because people press me. When is it going to get done? And make what I think is the best case estimate. And then stuff happens. Then everybody gets mad that I lied. I have never lied about these predictions. They're the best I can make. But I guess I overestimate my ability to get stuff done, and I underestimate the amount of interruptions and other projects and other demands that will distract me. And so on and so on. But it's in progress. I'm working on it. Creeping forward. But, one day, it will be done. And then, it will come out. And then, the next day, someone will tweet me, "When will we see a dream of spring?" Yes, I can see the future. I'm a science fiction guy.
What are you doing reveling in the joys of the book already being done? It ain't done yet. Get back to work on my book, you muppet. So George pretty much reiterated what he said here that he said on Colbert. And our last piece of information comes on December 8th of 2022, when The Late Show with Stephen Colbert released an online short of their Tuning Out the News segment. Now, hey, this is very important. Even though this was released in December of 2022, it was actually probably filmed back in October of that year when he was out in New York City for his regular stuff with The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. I might be wrong about that, but I highly doubt that they flew a crew all the way out to New Mexico just to grab these couple of clips. Anyway, in the interview, Dr. Ike Bloom appears to be sitting across from George at a big table with a very strong purple magenta to say, "Hey, wait a minute. This looks mighty familiar. I did this back in 2019. I'm just going to chuck this one up to a massive coincidence." Anyway, in the interview, author James Patterson asked George, "So how many pages do you have in these 11 years?
Oh, like 1100, 1200, something like that. Need another 400, 500.
Now, this is very specific compared to the others, and we'll get to it in a second, but I'd like to keep going forward. Now, over the summer in July 2023, George said he was working on the book almost every single day, and it was radio silent on TWOW until a segment released in November that was recorded on a podcast on October 7th of 2023. The podcast was called The Bangcast, the Festival Bang. Considering this is the only interview George gave at the time, I'm not 100% sure that he definitely knew what he was signing up for with this one. George didn't say much new here, except he reiterated the 1100 pages before. He didn't say the 1200 this time, but he also called TWOW a, quote, big mother of a book. Our chart is now complete, and we have a bevy of TWOW data. Now this is something to work with. What immediately jumps out to me is we have two kinds of quantitative data here. We have facts, and we have guesses. In the Game of Thrones interview, he said he thought the book might be 300 pages more than A Dance with Dragons, which would be about 1,800 pages. And then we have the 3/4 figure, and then we have the 400 to 500 figure. All of these are all reliant on Gurm predicting the end of the book. These are still predictions, they're not factual. Moving past these, the most important is the 1100 and 1200 figures. Presumably, these are factual, to a certain degree. The reason I believe in their veracity is George was visiting his US publisher, Random House, in New York City, right here in October of 2022. It was absolutely, without a doubt, completely and totally inevitable that they would ask and want to know where he was at with the Winds of Winter. If he showed up and didn't know how far along he was, just WTF, that's not going to play in Peoria. He had to have counted how many pages he had completed. Now the question here is why the two figures? There's an answer for that. George used to give only one figure in the past when he gave page counts, his finished, completed total. Adam Whitehead has a nice post here over on Westeros.org from back in 2015 where he's talking about how George used to give progress updates prior to 2011. And I think the same thing here probably still applies to George when he's talking to Tuning Out the News.
It may not be self-evident to people who have not spent over a decade studying the process, but it is precedented. This is exactly how Gurm has always worked since he started writing the series. Whenever he gives a progress report, it only includes the finished pages and the rough stuff is left out, because its value is unknown. It might need 5 minutes to fix up into a finished chapter, or 5 months. If he comments on roughs or partials, he specifically notes that this is the case.
So the takeaway from this is that there is no true definitive line of saying how many pages Gurm has at any particular time. The finished pages have like a comet's tail behind them of partial chapters, notes, maybe good lines he's thought of and wanted to commit to more than memory, etc. When he gave that 1100 and 1200, he could be very well at technically both. 1100 completed with an amorphous blob of unfinished stuff around it. However, we don't know this for certain, and when he gave that 2023 update and just reiterated the 1100, that is concerning. The pessimist would say he hasn't written anything. The moderate would say maybe he's just nearing completion on those partial chapters for the last year, and the optimist might say Gurm just didn't count the pages since 2022. I mean, he met with his publishers back then. Is he sitting around just counting the pages to his novel? Probably not, especially if he's working on it in DOSBox. That's going to be more cumbersome. So maybe he actually does have more by 2023, he just hasn't told us. So I'm not sure which one of these numbers is more relevant, because think about it from this perspective. What actually is reflecting where George R. R. Martin is at when he's writing The Winds of Winter? The finished plus the partials, or just the finished? I don't know. But we need to select one of these numbers for our chart, right? 1100 or 1200? No matter which one I would choose to use in the calculation, the other side is just going to say, well, you should have chosen the other number. Let's just consider that these are good figures that are usable, put a mark on them, and we'll come back to them when we have more information. Now, what about these other numbers here? The 1800 figure is, of course, derived from him saying he may need 300 more pages to complete The Winds of Winter. It seems like a blind guess because he likely hasn't prepared an update for his publishers when he said this. If we go back into the historical record, he actually said the 1800 figure in an interview during 2011 with James Hibbard with, at the time, Entertainment Weekly. James Hibbard asked, "So with the next book, have you now gotten to the point where you no longer need to have the characters in separate books?"
That is certainly my hope, yes. But 3 years from now, when I'm sitting on 1,800 pages of manuscript with no end in sight, who the hell knows?
I think this figure is best to just categorize as unreliable. It doesn't seem like there's anything other than supposition behind it. As for this 3/4 figure, it baffles me that this figure is still reiterated among fans and content creators alike as something to believe as the way, the truth, and the life. Do any of y'all even math, bro? We have his page count here, so we can use that to run a test on this figure. Let's take the average of his pages, the 1100 and 1200, average them out, we get 1150. And let's use that figure to compute what George is actually saying when he says he's 3/4 of the way done. We take the 1150, divide it by 3, multiply it by 4, and we get 1,533 pages. What? Oh, come on, there is no way 3/4 is an accurate mathematical representation of what he was saying. That's essentially the length of A Dance with Dragons. I have to ask you, does 1533 feel like anything close to matching what he said about the length of the book on the interview circuit?
Big book, possibly 300 pages longer, bigger than Dance, bigger than any previous volume, big mother of a book.
George might not have lied, but he was definitely bumping the proverbial pinball table on that one.
Nudging transforms pinball from a game of mechanical chance to a game of pure skill.
If anything, he should have said 2/3, because then 1150 divided by 2 times 3, and you get 1725. That's much more realistic to matching what he said than the 3/4. So why'd he say 3/4? I don't know. He gave that answer when Colbert pressed him pretty hard to tell people where he was at, and it's not like in the interview he can just run away or go offline or consult with his Random House dossier. But then he said it again for Random House, this time with the qualifier, maybe.
3/4 of the way done, maybe?
Personally, I'll give him a mulligan on it, but you gotta stop hitting that table. And the fandom should really stop mentioning this. Mark this one as bad. If y'all see people out there still saying the 3/4 figure after this, feel free to ask them if bro can even math and point them here. And lastly, we've got the 400 to 500 figure. Is it good? If we add 400 to 1150, you get 1550. Oh no, not again.
It won't really move, but once we get the game to start wiggling, it's easy to keep it going.
It's fallen afoul of the 3/4 problem again, of being too close to Dance. Well, what if we take the high bound, though, of this? Using the 500, then you get 1650. which suddenly seems maybe a bit plausible. This is actually a very awkward spot because this now seems both plausible and implausible. There is a pretty good way to test this, though, and let's look at the average in the context of the Winds of Winter. Averaging the 400 to 500 is obviously 450 pages. Now, how many chapters is that? The conversion for a Dance with Dragons manuscript pages into chapters is about 21, so 450 divided by 21, and we get roughly 21 chapters in 450 pages. Now, how many POVs are in the Winds of Winter? 21 if you include the prologue. Let's assume he's finished with the prologue. George has said he's done with Tyrion, and in the Colbert interview, he said some of the characters. So let's remove Tyrion, the prologue, and a rando from that total. We now have 18 POVs, and we have 21 chapters. This would mean George would have to complete 15 of those characters with just one more chapter, and the last 3 with getting just 2 chapters apiece. Now, does this make any sense? If we examine what he said in the Game of Thrones interview, he said he was close on some of the characters, but were not at all close on others. He called Tyrion at the time being close, with being 1 or 2 chapters away from completion. So, how exactly would he complete all of those not close characters when he can't give them any more than 2 chapters? It logically doesn't puzzle out. Some people might object here and think, well, George might be done with more POVs, but he tends not to complete many POVs at this point in the writing process, and you'll see the evidence for that in a little bit. For right now, just hold your horses on that evidence. Hold on, I can get an image for that. It's 2024, I've got AI art now. I need something better than that. Come on, Sydney, that horse looks awful. Look at this thing. I need a horse where people are going to take me seriously. Oh, okay, there we go. That's perfect. Wait, do people really hold horses anymore? Almost no one has horses. Put that horse on the back burner. Anyway, how really low is this 400 to 500 figure? Well, you can see that by comparing it to, let's say George said that he was 500 to 600 pages away from completing the book. Taking 550 this time as the average, and you get 26 chapters. 5 chapters more, not a whole lot. But this means you could have 14 not close characters get 1 chapter, and 4 not close characters get 3 chapters. Might not be much, but those 5 chapters can buy you a lot of real estate when you have such a conservative estimation. And it at least plausibly opens the book up to at least bringing it in for some kind of a landing. So why'd George R. R. Martin say he'd only have 400 to 500 pages remaining for the Winds of Winter?
Every bounce of the ball can be affected by the player when they know the right moves to make.
I don't know, probably the same reason anyone else would say it. It sounds way smaller. How big does 400 to 500 sound? It's not small, but it's totally manageable. Now how big does 500 to 600 sound? Oh, it wouldn't be the first time I've seen a fandom lose its collective mind over those numbers.
The PlayStation 3 will be available at retail for $499 US and $599 US.
Yeah, 500 to 600 sounds like a lot, like the size of a giant enemy crab. With all this info and TWOW seemingly needing like 600 minimum pages to go, what is the prognosis for completing the Winds of Winter relatively soon? People have said there's a possibility of 2024. Just wait until after Worldcon. Okay, what is a fast George R. R. Martin writing speed? If we go back to the turn of the millennium, George wrote around 300 pages per year. Let's just consider he's writing at that for right now. So if he began the year needing 600 pages, even if he stepped on the gas going that fast to start the year, he'd still only be 1/4 of the way through the minimum requirements to complete the book. Thus, if you currently are one of the people who thinks The Winds of Winter is coming out in 2024 or even 2025, I would seriously recommend reevaluating that stance. And to cap that off, there was something I told you was very interesting that was buried in the Game of Thrones interview. And now that we have all this information, let's go back and listen for it. The key to listen for is that he says the same information twice about 2 very different things. So remember, George recently said that he's at 1,200 pages. Now let's go back and listen to that Game of Thrones interview when George is talking about working on the Winds of Winter.
And I won't be done with the book, but I'll be done with Tyrion's role in this particular book. And then I'll have to focus on another character. Some of whom are also close, some of whom are not at all close. So, and then hopefully it all fits together, and I don't know.
So George is at 1,200 pages. He says some of the POVs are close, some of whom are not at all close. Talks about organization and things fitting together, and his conclusion is all, hopefully it comes together. Now let's listen to him talk about A Game of Thrones.
That fell apart very quickly. I mean, I was writing Game of Thrones, and I was writing it, and you know, at a certain point I said, I have like 1,200 pages here, and I'm not even close on some of these characters. I better reorganize that. And then, okay, it's a 4-book trilogy.
So he concluded he needed to add a book to the series in that case. So you know what they say. The Amazon is not just a river in South America. It's also a North American company. And there's a river in North America called the Mississippi. But the Mississippi isn't just a river in North America. It's also a state. And a state of being is also known as denial. It's what George is in when he thinks about the Winds of Winter. So to conclude the TWOW media spree in summary, George was or is at 1,100 to 1,200 manuscript pages. His 1,800 page figure is unreliable, the 3/4 figure is bonk, and the 400 to 500 figure should be thrown off a cliff. Which brings us back to our equation. We did find 2 possible values for where Gurm is at, and we found 2 dates to use for computing Gurm's TWOW writing speed in the future. However, we didn't find any reasonable predictions here from George on figuring out the length overall of the Winds of Winter. But I said earlier that we could figure out how long the Winds of Winter is actually going to be. So if George R.R. Martin, the writer, doesn't know how long it's going to be, how can we figure out how long it's going to be? I suggest we look at what we know. We have 2 instances from the past when Germ thought it would take him 1 book, and it took him 2. With the Game of Thrones, at some point he had written what we're going to call A, and he thought that he needed B, to eventually end up at point C. But he never ended up at point C, he ended up needing 2 books, and ended up at D. Point C never existed, it was just wishful thinking. Same thing happened with A Dance with Dragons. At one point he was at A, he thought he needed B, he believed he would end up at C, but he never did. C never existed, he ended up at D. And so with the Winds of Winter, he is at point A again. He thinks he needs B, and he believes he will end up at C. But the problem, as we know, is C doesn't actually exist. He's going to end up at D. So here's your algebraic word problem. George has given us A for the Winds of Winter, 1,100 to 1,200. He's also given us his B, his 400 to 500. We know he's not going to end up in C because C doesn't exist. He's going to end up at D. So how do we solve for D? Well, we need to find E, the amount that needs to be added to A plus B to get us to D. In simpler terms, we need a Nostramartin, an additional George R. R. Martin who is actually good at predicting the future to get us all the way to point D. But we don't know E. How exactly are we supposed to find it? We look back in the past, we have the values of D for A Game of Thrones, A Clash of Kings, A Feast for Crows, and A Dance with Dragons. So what we need to solve for E is we need an A and a B for one of these. Some moment, some small snapshot of time, when George knew he was at a certain point and also predicted B. And if we have those 2 values, then we can solve for E. Once we have E, we can add it to the A and the B for the Winds of Winter, and that will give us D, the eventual length of the Winds of Winter. Or at least somewhere in the ballpark that's better than looking at point C. Now you might be thinking, if E is basically another book, why not simply double it? Because that's not really specific enough, nor is a flat value or even a direct ratio going to be that good. No, our Nostramartin is going to be a series of multiplication factors that narrow in on a chapter categorization basis. And we'll be able to perform something that's specific because of the quality of the data. Now, where are we going to find those A and those B values to calculate that E value? Well, this is where that Reddit post comes in that I mentioned earlier, which is going to allow us to solve for E and figure out how long TWOW is going to be. And that takes us back to A Song of Ice and Fire in 2022, when one user by the name of G-Steph discovered that latchkey, that ability to solve for E, and find out how long the Winds of Winter is probably going to be. But the story of G-Steph begins a bit before that. We have to go back to the lovely memories of 2015 Our Song of Ice and Fire, where user Honeybird on the subreddit went on a mission, a pilgrimage, to the Texas A&M library, the Cushing Library, where George had stored all of his manuscripts and notes that he had worked on for the previous volumes in the series. There, Honeybird took a look at George's A Dance with Dragons manuscript. And among other things, the most famous thing is that she discovered the debunking of the theory that Benjen is not, in fact, Cold Hands. Although if you read the book, the text says he died long ago. That was the joke at the start of the video. Anyway, point is, after this, George immediately locked A Dance with Dragons behind lock and key until after the Winds of Winter is finished. So nobody had access anymore to looking at A Dance with Dragons. And there it is sat for 8 years, and nobody has gone down there to take another look. Until G-Steph. See, the thing is, while A Dance with Dragons is no longer accessible, A Feast for Crows was. And as we have discussed before, A Feast for Crows is really just the first half of A Dance with Dragons. And in all of these, because A Feast for Crows is at that point before he split the book, they all contain George's plans for A Dance with Dragons. So really what we're looking at is George's attempt to write the last book before it was split in two. G-Steph found a lot of cool stuff here, but a lot of it's kind of out of the scope of this video, so we're just going to stick to the stuff that we need. So he found 3 different pre-production manuscripts of A Feast for Crows, one from late 2003 and 2 from 2004. G-Steph photographed and produced tables of contents of these drafts, and so we now have a point A from George's A Feast for Crows. Not just one, we have 3 distinct versions. Now the first 2 of these, they're not really going to help us, because as we discussed, we need an A and a B, not just an A. But this third draft, well, that one is very special, because inside George has created special placeholders for chapters that he had been working on but had yet to complete, as well as ending the draft with a full listing of all of the chapters that he believed he still needed to write to complete the book. We have a detailed copy of what George is actually saying when he makes one of these predictions, something that will allow us to solve for E and figure out why his predictions always go awry. But wait, there's more. And that's because down here at the end of the draft, there is something very interesting. And that is this number right down here. 1067. This is the completed page count for the June 2004 manuscript. And that's not all of the pages that are here. Let's calculate out exactly what the page count of this manuscript is. So you got these fake pages over here. Well, these aren't real pages, so we gotta take them out. And if we scroll back to the top, we can see that George is still struggling with that prologue, so he just has one placeholder page here for it right now. So we gotta take these placeholders out. So let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 for the last one. Okay, so let's reduce our 1067 by 6, which gives us 1061. Now what we want to do is go over here and look at our placeholder chapters. Now some of these chapters in here are unwritten, and other ones are partially written. What we want to do is we want to exclude the ones that he hasn't written anything for, but we want to include pages for the ones that he has partials of. So let's count these out. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Also bear in mind these down here, these are under consideration. These are actually colored green for my red-green colorblind friends out there. I know that you guys can't see the difference between these two colors, so it's different. So let's add our 12 chapters over here. And considering the page count per chapter that George is using here is roughly about 20 pages per chapter, since these are partials, let's just multiply them by 10. Let's say they're all halfway. Some are probably more, some are probably nearly done, some are probably barely done. That gives us 120, which leaves us with a total page count of this draft of 1,181. That is smack dab right in between George's 1,100 and 1,200. We have a copy of the prior book at the exact moment George is at now, with his exact same page count. And did you notice something else that might be even more important than that? Well, what is the total amount of pages? Well, we look over here and we see he has 48 chapters completed. We look over at the partials, we got the prologue up here, that's number 1, and then we have all these partial chapters that he has plugged in here. He has 27 of those. We add those together, and we get 75 chapters. Then we multiply those by the 20 pages per chapter, and we get 1,500 manuscript pages. We have a copy of the prior book at the exact moment in time that George was when he gave us this TWOW update. I mean, even if you thought that this was going to be apples to oranges, this is, at the very least, more like oranges to mandarins, right? And it's somewhat surprising to me that George R. R. Martin even did this, because he's on the record saying he doesn't like outlines.
Don't write outlines. I hate outlines.
Even in the Waterstone letter, he says,
As you know, I don't outline my novels.
So why does this even exist? I think the reason George R. R. Martin did this was mostly for his publishers. When we look back at the handy chart, we can see he didn't mention the 3/4 figure at all until his October visit to New York City when he met with his publishers at Random House. You know, one question I have to ponder about that meeting is, did George put together a full draft like this for his publishers during whatever meetings took place in 2022? I mean, if he had a minor outline in his hands and in his head, it would explain why he got so frisky with all the numbers all of a sudden like. He hadn't told us much details at all until this. It would also make sense why he thought it then might go beyond 1,500. If he had looked at everything that he had planned out already, how far he was going over and was like,
Oh, geez, it's happening again.
So I don't know if that's true or not, but it's interesting to think about. But now is not the time to ponder. Now is the time to make progress. Because if we're going to unlock any more secrets about TWOW, we're going to have to dig deeper into this 2004 draft. Because I want to find out what the heck is happening with George's prediction here. Let's construct a chart based on the framework of what we were doing earlier that allows us to compare George R. R. Martin's A and his B of A Feast for Crows to the finished A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons draft and find out what he really needed. So on the left side of our chart over here, we have our POVs just like last time. And at the bottom, we have the chapter count. Now, I'm only going to populate it with Danny's to start with so the numbers don't get overwhelming. So we have a column here for George's completed chapters. Danny has 4 at this time in the A Feast for Dragons June 2004 draft. I'm going to call it A Feast for Dragons when it's combined just to make it simpler on myself. Once again, we'd consider this to be George R. R. Martin's point A. And then to the right of that, we have the predicted column, George R. R. Martin's B, how many chapters he thinks he still needed to write to complete the book. And once more over to that, we have the predicted total, George R. R. Martin's C, the point that didn't exist, the total amount of chapters that he believed he needed to complete the book for that character. And last but not least, of course, we have George R. R. Martin's point D, the actual true number of chapters that would end up in the final volumes of A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. So what we're going to do now is we're going to subtract the predicted total out of the A Feast for Dragons total, and then we get a new column for how far he went over. So George had originally predicted he would write 8 chapters, he would eventually put 10 into the 2 books, and so he went over by 2 chapters. And the column to the right of that, how far he had to go, is taking the chapters that he went over plus his predicted. So as an example, George originally thought he needed 4 chapters for Danny to complete the book, but what he really needed was 6 so that he could get his count up to 10 for the final published volume. Everything all clar? Okay, well, let's go ahead and populate this and see what we've got. All right, so we have our chapter counts here at the bottom. We have the 48, the 27, and the 75, and then the 119 from the completed book. Now here's where it gets interesting. So George was predicting that he'd need just 27 chapters to complete Dance. Well, it turns out he actually needed an additional 71. So he ends up going over the 27 by 44. So 27 becomes 71. Yeah, flip those digits around. So what POVs at this point has George completed? See, this is why earlier I told you to put that horse on the back burner. We're gonna see how many characters he had finished with the help of our— Oh God! Oh no, it took me all of 5 minutes to generate you, horse. I feel somewhat responsible. I'd like to give you a short eulogy. You may not have been with us long, but you will help us find Son of Kong. Let us all remember the good times we had as we bid you adieu with Scarlett Johansson and beautiful cabin crew. In your memory, let's find out what POVs George R. R. Martin had completed. What characters does he have 0 predictions for in the predicted column, and he actually ends up not writing any additional chapters for them for the rest of the story? All you really got is Ariadne. He is not completing that many characters at this point in the story. So when we had figured earlier that George had completed the prologue and then 2 additional characters for the Winds of Winter, that would pretty much be exactly where George R. R. Martin is at when he has 1,200 pages done in the writing process. This leads us to investigating the saga of the close and the not close characters. So what characters here does George have that are close? When we examine the predicted chapters column, we can identify 11 characters who are only supposed to get 1 more chapter and a handful of characters who are supposed to receive 2 to 4. Let's consider these 11 are our close characters. Out of these 11, how many does George nail his prediction? He ends up getting 2 of them exactly right. He writes 1 additional chapter for Davos, and he writes 1 additional chapter for Hota. So you might think, okay, well, he's going to go over then with the other 9. Well, no, not exactly. He actually ends up writing no chapters for 4 of them. He predicts that he is going to give them another chapter, but he ends up either writing it and taking it away or not writing it. Sansa loses her last chapter. It ends up going into TWOW as the Elaine 1 sample chapter. Jaime doesn't have the perspective under consideration chapter written and has a consolidation of 2 of his chapters in the book being merged into 1, so he actually loses 2. Aaron Greyjoy's last chapter, which is presumably the Forsaken, is also moved into the Winds of Winter. And Aerys Oakheart, dies in Ariane's Queenmaker chapter, and he loses his final outing in the book. So those 4 predictions end up becoming 0. So we've accounted for 6 out of the 11 chapters. What about the other 5? How bad is it, Doc? Give it to me straight. Well, it's not great, not terrible. He thinks he needs 1 for Bran, but he gives him 3. Arya goes over by 1. Brienne gets the lion's share of them at 4 more chapters. Victarion lives, so he gets an additional chapter beyond the 1 he's allocated, and Asha gets 3 more instead of just 1. So in total, out of these last 5, George ends up writing 14 chapters between them. So out of all of the close characters in the book, these 11 chapters end up becoming 16. Not great, not terrible. That's an increase of about 45%. So we should suspect for any close characters in the Winds of Winter to be receiving an additional 45% in chapters than George originally allocated. So one of the key reasons George R. R. Martin's predictions are way off is he thinks he's close on a character, but really he's got a 50-50 shot at being right about that prediction. To give him a bit of credit here, he is right about half of the time. Fans crack jokes about George R. R. Martin's predictions, but he's not terribly stupid on these. He just doesn't predict what he doesn't know yet. That in the course of his gardening, he's going to think up an additional moment for about half of the characters for which he's going to want to add an additional chapter. He just doesn't realize it yet because he doesn't have those ideas in his head yet to know that he's going to want to write that. But this isn't really where the big bloat comes from. There are 5 he did believe that he was not close on at that time. We've got Dany, Tyrion, Jon, Samwell, and Cersei. How bad is it here? Well, this time it's pretty bad. As we said earlier, Dany is supposed to get 4, but she really needs 6. Tyrion is supposed to only have 2 more chapters, but George gives him a 9. Jon is supposed to get 4 more. He gets 10 more. Sam is supposed to get 2. He gets 4 more. And Cersei, who is already getting 6 chapters in the book, is only supposed to get 3 more. She ends up receiving 6. So on average, when George expects a character to be not close, he expects them to get about 3 more chapters. But in reality, he doesn't just give them 3 more chapters. So between the 5 of them, they should have just gotten 15 chapters. They end up getting 35. So we take 35 divided by 15, and George ends up going over with an increase of 133, repeating, of course, 133%. That is not good. And now you see where a lot of the size increase comes in these volumes. It's not really the minor POVs, it's that George is underestimating how much he needs to write for his core characters. I mean, yeah, the size increases because there are more minor characters, but in George's predictions, it's that he's grossly undervaluing how much he needs to increase the size for those POVs. And now we know at least a fair chunk of why George R. R. Martin's predictions always go awry. But there is one more piece of information here, a qualitative piece of information, that I think we should still review. Adam Feldman in the comments went digging through some old internet fossils and found a comment from George from around the exact same time that he made pertaining to this very draft that he was doing for A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons. So if we're splitting hairs over how accurate George R. R. Martin's off-the-cuff comments are, how accurate were his comments back then when it pertains to the draft? Because if he's getting things wrong, then it could very well be that some of the stuff that he's saying to us is a little bit inaccurate. Here is what George said many years ago.
As of today, I have finished 48 chapters and have another 18 partially written. Half a dozen of them are within a few whiskers of completion. The good news is that I have recently completed the final Jaime chapter for this volume. I'm very close on Arya and Sansa too, and fairly close on Tyrion. The not-so-good news is that all the other viewpoints remain incomplete, and one crucial one is barely half done. The prologue is giving me fits as well, but as of last night, I think I may have finally solved it.
So does this stuff line up? He has 48 chapters, that's true, but he says he has another 18 partially written. He only has 12 in this draft. Where'd he get those other 6 chapters? Well, don't worry, because I have a friend in the South, a friend in the Reach, who can help turn this into a win. Let me give him a call. Yes, I'd like to speak with Brad, please. Look, great, Brad, how's it going? Look, I got a favor I gotta ask you. All I want to do is this. I just want you to find 6 chapters. Cushing Library, Brad, Texas A&M. We know what they're doing. They're shredding the chapters, Brad. Brad? Well, so much for that. So where do you get these other 6?
It might not seem like a good idea to tilt, given the considerable penalty, but the upside of risking a tilt will result in much higher scores.
The specific 6 missing here aren't that important, but there is something here he said that is a bit more important for our analysis. He says he's fairly close on Tyrion. We categorize Tyrion as not close. So what gives? Well, he's got 2 more chapters remaining for Tyrion. Both of these are actually partially written chapters, and he just said here that a couple of them are within a few whiskers. Whatever that means. So what do we do about this, because our chart computes Tyrion as not close? I don't really think it's a problem or that we need to change anything, and here's why. First, George says Tyrion is fairly close, not just close. And while the words here might seem virtually the same, I think there is a gulf between the two in the writing process. Imagine what it means to intend to give your character just one more chapter in a book. You've pretty much wrapped up their story in your head, right? You know exactly what you wanted out of that character in the book, and you wrote it, and it just needs a bow on the end. And sure, half of the time George thinks of another chapter to add to them, but they never balloon in size. The same cannot be said for characters who have 2 or more chapters. And I mean, this A Feast for Crows, A Dance with Dragons bears that out. You look at the 2 characters who are intended to get 2 more chapters, Tyrion and Samwell, and both of them double their chapter counts. It's a small sample size, but I think it's relevant. And I think characters George is intending to give 2 chapters to share more in common with characters he intends to give 4 to than they share with characters he intends to get 1 to. So if we were to dump characters like Tyrion and Sam into the close column, I think we would be damaging our formula rather than improving it. So I think that settles that. The only other thing here in this qualitative comment that Georgie Porgy left us is he says he recently completed the final Jaime chapter. But in the draft, he still has an additional chapter he's considering giving Jaime in the book. So he really wasn't sure he was done with Jaime yet he told his fans he was.
Remember to keep trying, keep tilting, and find out exactly what you can get away with.
Oh, George. Nevertheless, we now have our E, our Nostramartin. By using the 45% and the 133%, we can create formulas based on these values, and we can add that to our equation. But you're asking me, Curdy Birdie, if you're using those numbers, we don't know how many close and not close characters he has. That's okay, because all we need is a range. We know in A Feast for Dragons he was working on 17 POVs at the time of this draft. He had completed Arianne, and I'll give it to him, he gets Jaime. He completed Jaime, he has 2 done. That's 2 out of 17, or 11.76%. We know in TWOW he has 20 regular POVs, so we take those 20 and we multiply it by 1 minus that 11.76%, and we get 17.65 POVs remaining for what we should expect to see in the Winds of Winter. Does this line up? We know he's completed Tyrion, and he said some of the characters, so if he's including the prologue plus a rando, that's 18. Maybe he's done with 2 more regular POVs other than Tyrion, which would be 17. And I'll give him further the benefit of the doubt. Maybe this time he's done with 3 more regular POVs other than Tyrion, so 16. What about 15? I'm sure that there are some optimists out there clamoring for me to give him a quarter of the characters in the book, but you're not learning from George R. R. Martin, are you?
Slides are the most extreme nudges. They are a desperation measure.
That would be 25%, not 11.76%. And remember, he said, I am done with a couple of the characters. A couple is 2. He didn't say a quarter of the characters in the book. In the interest of community, I'll do 16, meaning 4 regular POVs as our bound, but I'm drawing the line at going down to 15. Therefore, we can safely posit out that he has somewhere between 18 POVs remaining maximum, with a minimum of 16. Now, some, of course, are going to tell me again,
George is bloodthirsty. He loves killing off characters. He's probably got a lot less.
Okay, let me riddle you this. How many POVs has George killed off that he has, 1, not introduced as a POV in that book, or 2, have returned to life in some way? So all of the prologues and the epilogues are out, because they were introduced as POVs in that book. That leaves Eddard Stark, who was introduced as a POV in that book, Catelyn Stark, who came back to life sort of as Stoneheart, Ares Oakheart, who was again introduced as a POV in that book, Quentin Martell, who was introduced again as a POV in that book, and Jon Snow, who is coming back to life. Again, George R. R. Martin, not that really willing to kill off his core characters. He just isn't. I'm sorry, you've been living a meme. I'm not even sure if I really need to make this point as much anymore after I made that point in the last video. George has actually pulled back on the bloodthirsty notion a bit in interviews since then. I mean, he explains it better than I did, that essentially he makes you feel the impact of fewer characters dying, therefore you think that he is so bloodthirsty, but really he's not. It's the impact that resonates with people, which I think is very true. But as far as raw, sheer POV devastation in the Winds of Winter, we might see it, but I mean, it would be very unprecedented. My point is, George is probably actually about halfway done through the Winds of Winter right now, so if we start plugging in that he's whacked a whole bunch of characters in the first half, that's probably going to lead to a less accurate model than a more accurate one. Now that we have a range for POVs remaining, we can figure out how many close characters exist by also looking at the historical record. In each of the 4 major books, George always has 6 characters with at least 7 or more chapters. 6 in A Game of Thrones, 6 in A Clash of Kings, 6 in A Storm of Swords, and 7 in A Feast for Dragons. In examining these POVs who have gotten a bulk of chapters, Catelyn and Eddard are gone, so they're out. But who is left? We can calculate their percentage chance of getting them in the Winds of Winter. Dany received these in 2 out of the 4 books, so we should calculate that she has about a 50% chance of getting 7 or more in the Winds of Winter. Tyrion, we already know, he has a 100% chance of getting 7 or more. George said he's got a lot of Tyrion in this book. Tyrion's getting a lot of chapters. Jon had 7 or more in all 4, so he has a 100% chance of getting 7 or more in the Winds of Winter, but he's dead. I mean, he's almost surely coming back to life as a POV in some way in this book. Jon's status itself doesn't really matter, because as we talked about in the first video, there are certain locations in the story where George always wants to have a POV, like Cersei. He always wants to have a POV at King's Landing. He's always wanted to have a POV in the far north at Castle Black or Beyond the Wall to sort of gauge that major threat. Bran being Tree Boy doesn't really cut it. So if Jon ain't back yet, I mean, until he comes back, essentially you're saying Melisandre's going to combine with him to sort of take his load. Then you have Bran, he's 50-50. Sansa is 50-50. Arya is 50-50. Theon is 50-50. Smaller sample size, yet still relevant. Jaime is also 100%. Cersei was only in the last book, but she's the King's Landing POV, at least for right now, so I would say probably 100%. Brienne and Jaime are also 100%, but they might end up splitting that length altogether. So if we list them back out, Tyrion is locked in as being one of these characters. Jon and Mel are going to combine in some way to be two. Jaime and Brienne may combine together, so there's your third. Cersei is going to be your fourth. And then Theon, Arya, Sansa, Bran, and Dany, you can all combine together their 50%. And so out of those 5 characters, you would expect 2.5 of them to become major characters again in this book. So totaling these up, that gives us 6.5. That sounds about right. Some of y'all might think Bran and Arya and Sansa should be weighted lower, but if not them, I think Sam or Arianne also have high chances of getting more, since he really likes writing for Sam. He's the only POV in Old Town. And don't talk to me about Aaron Greyjoy. I don't think him and Euron are doing Old Town, although that would make for a fun spin-off if George ever wants to license it to Mike Judge. And Arianne and John Connington have to cover the Aegon plot, or they might take over King's Landing, so yeah, 5 to 7 major characters getting 7 or more chapters seems like a very realistic thing. So what does this all mean for our equation? Since George R. R. Martin has only mentioned Tyrion being done, and he thinks he is 2/3 of the way done, that means 5 to 6 of these characters are going to get a minimum of 7 chapters. Doing the math on this to compute the average chapters that we think should already be completed would be a minimum of 7 divided by 3 times 2, which would give you 4.6 chapters so far for each of these characters on average completed, meaning they would have a minimum of 2.3 chapters remaining. Ergo, they would all fall into the not close category. Now, yes, George does tend to write ahead with certain POVs more than others, and sometimes, just like Jaime or Tyrion, he will surge ahead with a specific character. But he tends to do this in clutches of chapters, not their entire story in one sitting. So Cersei in The Winds of Winter might be written in 3 chapters at 3 or 4 separate times rather than 9 or 12 chapters all at once. So altogether, we can safely suspect George has 18 to 16 POVs remaining to write and 5 to 6 characters who are not close. We don't need to speculate then on the number of close characters because they're a simple subtraction of the close total from the remaining POVs. And when we look now at our equation, we can see it starting to come together. The astute observer is also going to notice a pair of 2 things. One, what be R? What is R? And we'll get to that in a second, but that's pages per chapter. Since we can only find George R. R. Martin's point D in chapter count, we'll need to convert that to manuscript pages so that they are a like figure with the 1100 to 1200 to subtract out the pages he's written. The second thing that you might notice is, well, if you are dividing A by R here, and then multiplying A by R, and then subtracting out A, do you really need A in the numerator at all? I mean, you would be right. This equation could just be the pages remaining for George R. R. Martin to write in TWOW divided by his writing speed. But that equation doesn't give us a bird's eye view of the book like this one does, and I think it's been easier to explain and understand with what we have been trying to do since the beginning of this video. So for consistency, we're going to stick with it looking like this, even though I know it's not as simple as it could be. Anyway, what is B and what is E? Well, I thought B was 400 to 500. Oh, no. That went off a cliff a long time ago. You guys should have seen it too. That 400 to 500 with characters getting 2 chapters maximum was nothing like what we saw in the A Feast for Dragons draft. He had a whole bunch of characters needing more than 2 chapters in that. Anyway, the beauty of the Nostramartin is it is a ghoul who can not only give us E, but also possess his qualitative comments to rebuild his B to make it into something that will make qualitative and quantitative sense. Therefore, George R. R. Martin's realistic mathematical B can be calculated by taking the 5 or 6 not close POVs, multiplying them by the 3-chapter average, adding in the 18 to 16 remaining POVs, subtracting out then the 5 to 6 not close POV characters, and multiplying those by the 1-chapter average. And then to get the Nostramartin, the E, it's the 5 to 6 close POVs receiving their average of 3 chapters, multiplied then by 133.3%, plus then 18 to 16 remaining POVs, minus the 5 to 6 close POVs receiving the 1 average chapter, multiplying those then by 45%, which then will equal your remaining pages for The Winds of Winter. Y'all still with me? We're essentially recalculating George R. Martin's B based on what we know how he thinks from the A Feast for Crows draft and his qualitative interview statements rather than what number he gave us, and then adding that into the Nostramartin based on the A Feast for Crows draft to get us his pages remaining for The Winds of Winter. And if this doesn't happen to be your favorite formula, then just keep rereading it until you like it. That leaves us with 2 more things to find, R and George's writing speed. Let's do R and then close out the numerator. In looking at George's pages per chapter in the 4 major books, George began low at around 15 manuscript pages per chapter, and steadily increased it up into the time of A Feast for Dragons. So should we assume he will increase it again? What about those Winds of Winter sample chapters? Well, George R. R. Martin tends to trim chapters when the book is ready for publishing, so the TWOW sample chapters aren't cut down to their final size yet, so we can't really use those, apples and oranges and everything. The key here is to look at what happened during the main 3 writing periods of A Feast for Dragons. Now, I can't get exact manuscript counts per chapter, but I can calculate them based upon the word count to within about plus or minus 1 page. So these aren't going to be entirely precise, but they will be accurate for a population to draw conclusions. After performing these calculations, which took a while, the June 2004 A Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons draft that we looked up had 48 chapters in it that were eventually published, completed, and trimmed at 1,073 manuscript pages, which is an average of 22.35 pages per chapter. In the next group, the remaining 13 A Feast for Crows chapters that were not written in that draft, that would have been written largely during 2004 and 2005, came in at 282 manuscript pages published, or 21.69 pages per chapter. And then the third batch, the pages written for A Dance with Dragons after A Feast for Crows was published, that do not include the pages that were in the Feast for Dragons draft, so these are pages written between 2007 and 11, these came in at 1,227 manuscript pages in 59 chapters, which gives us an average of 20.80. So as of the most recent part of A Song of Ice and Fire that was published, Gurm had been decreasing his pages per chapter. So what do we choose for the Winds of Winter? Well, we kind of need a range again, and I think we should use something that encompasses all the books here, to a degree. I think it's unlikely that he'll go down below A Game of Thrones, and I think it's unlikely that he'll go above the count for A Feast for Dragons. But it's also extremely unlikely that he will write like he did back in 1996, when you could pick up a copy of A Game of Thrones by mail order, sandwiched in your mailbox between a Bob Dole flyer and an AOL floppy disk. I mean, the composition of these books is also way different. You could have fewer pages per chapter because a lot of these characters are very close in proximity. Sansa, Arya, Ned, they're essentially entirely in the same spot for all of A Game of Thrones. Months rarely pass between these chapters either. There's a lot less setup and common secondary characters between them. When we think about it, TWOW really should look more like A Feast for Dragons, just maybe not as bulky. So we shouldn't really go with a strict average between all these 4, because that would be a little excessive. A Game of Thrones should not have the same weight in the subcalculation as A Feast for Dragons does. One option would be to go then with a linear weighted average, increasing the weight by 1 with each book. However, this is still kind of lopsided. If we look at these weights, our equation would then be calculating that there would be a 30% chance that TWOW would be equal in composition to A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings, 2 books from over 25 years ago. And also, A Feast for Dragons in this weighting only has about a 10% greater proportional chance of representation than A Storm of Swords. I think a fair assessment would be to use these weighted averages, but go just a bit further than that and use what is called a quadratic weighted average. That means taking each weight and squaring it. This yields an equation that is probably much more realistic, where these first 2 books are represented, but they're at a much lower power. If we look at the changes to the weights, both account now for 16% probability instead of 30%. 16% is small, but it's large enough that they still have somewhat of an impact on our calculation. A Storm of Swords maintains its 30%, and A Feast for Dragons excels to being above 50% representation. Altogether, I think this is a good, fair assessment for fairly weighting the last book, but also taking into account that George R. R. Martin has decreased his pages per chapter recently, yet it shouldn't be so strong that we should expect it to revert all the way into the past. Jumping back into our equation, we can now add this one in for R. That's 14.904 times 1 to the power of 2 plus 16.914 times 2 to the power of 2 plus 18.549 times 3 to the power of 2, plus 21.622 times 4 to the power of 2, all divided then incredibly by 30. That's one more variable down, and now we have our numerator finally solved. That leaves us with just one more thing to investigate, and that's George R. R. Martin's writing speed. Initially, I thought this would be a fairly straightforward thing to compute. You take the 1100 to 1200 and divide it by the period of time he's been writing it. But that would only be applicable if his writing was linear. And when I investigated A Dance with Dragons, well, new things came to light. See, George gave us a lot of hard data on dance in a blog post titled Talking About the Dance. In it, he lists all of the partial manuscripts he submitted to his publisher with their dates and page counts. I charted this out and I graphed it. The first thing I wanted to do was investigate how the Milanese knot affected the writing speed of dance. Everyone has talked about the Milanese knot in the fandom being the reason why the book didn't come out for so long. But as we chart George R. R. Martin's writing speed through dance and look at every single time that he mentions the Milanese knot on his blog, it turns out the knot appears to have barely affected his writing speed at all. The Milanese knot, as far as the book coming out, was not the problem. It was more just a problem for his not a blog. Rather, the problem with the Dance with Dragons writing is when I show you the full graph of his writing speed. See, I'm only showing you the second half right now. Let's take that and zoom that out. Oof. What is this? Well, after rereading every Not-a-blog during this period, the short answer is the writing wasn't going well. I mean, he wasn't writing it at all. Well. So while I'm sure the Milanese knot was a hurdle for Gurm to overcome, it was not and never was the reason dance took so long. The fandom you've been living in is a lie. The reason why Dance with Dragons took 6 years to come out was because for 2.5 of those years, George wasn't writing the book. Well. And when we chart out when George R. R. Martin mentioned stuff on his blog about writing for wins, it seems to be mostly backlogged to within the past few years, quite akin to this same type of graph. While some writing was probably done on wins during the 2010s, it doesn't look like that much progress was made until the Great Spring Sickness of 2020. And I'm not sure what was going on during some of these months. Was he working on Fire and Blood? Elden Ring? Spin-offs? My Left Toe? With regards to TWOW and our calculation, if we're following this sort of pattern for dance, then where are we? Are we at the point where TWOW's page count starts to experience rapid growth just like dance because Gurm has finally gotten on that bike like he did with dance to get it done? Or are we actually still back here in the dearth of the writing and the surge that happened during the Great Spring Sickness was just a fluke? Since George didn't give us a higher page count at the end of 2023, it seems like both are actually possibilities. So how are we going to compute this? Well, we're going to go for a low bound and a high bound, but let's calculate his static average first. We know he had probably 1150-ish manuscript pages in October of 2020, so let's just use those two figures for this ballpark. And since we know that he had written pages for The Winds of Winter during the period of writing for Dance, we need a date to compute from that just isn't the date that Dance with Dragons came out. We can't compute this one from zero. The earliest known place where George gave us a page count is in an interview with Rolling Stone in issue 1157 on May 24th of 2012, titled The Man Behind the Throne. In the article, George states at this time that he had completed 200 pages on TWOW. So subtracting the 200 out of the 1,150, we get 950, then divided by the difference between October 2020 and the May 24th of 2012, we get an average writing speed per year of 91.17. That is awfully turtly. Now let's compute the low bound and the high bound. Looking at the A Dance with Dragons writing graph, if we're really here in the middle of the dearth rather than here at the beginning of the uptick, then we can expect the writing to go poorly for another long dearth writing period, roughly equal in length to the first one. So all we need to do to calculate this is double the amount of time of this dearth period without adding any pages to our count. Figuring that the dearth period was about 7.75 years, we add this to the October value, recompute the average, and we get an average page count per year of 52.28. That is not great. For the high bound, there's a really easy way to do this. We know Gurm wrote on other Westerosi projects during this period, namely The World of Ice and Fire and Blood. Now, there's a bit of overlap between those two books. I calculated that somewhere between 190 to 303 pages that was intended to be included in the former made it into the latter. But the specifics of that for our calculation really don't matter all that much, so long as those pages were written roughly between 2011 and 2018. At least for Fire and Blood. I don't want to really touch the World of Ice and Fire because it's such a weird collaborative project that it really shouldn't factor into this. But I do want to factor in that hypothetically, we know Gurm is capable of writing about Westeros more than he did on the Winds of Winter during the 13 years, because he did write more on Westeros, just not for the book that everyone actually wanted to read. So hypothetically, what if he churned that 989 manuscript pages for Fire and Blood into hypothetical The Winds of Winter chapters instead? That would give us a realistic maximal bound based on what he was certainly capable of over the same period. So all we have to do to that is add those 989 manuscript pages intended for Fire and Blood into our count here, and we get 186.07 pages per year average. Well, that is certainly more productive. And there it is, we have solved our equation. All variables are accounted for. But looking at our equation, most of the elements here have 2 or more bounds rather than a single value. How exactly are we going to calculate this? The equation is fine, it has everything we need. The problem is our data is imperfect. We have variables for which we do not know the correct answers. What is the true total manuscript pages complete? What date for his count is more reliable, 2022 or 2023? How many POVs does he have left? Will there be an epilogue to expand the book's page counts by another chapter? I forgot about that one. And will George R. R. Martin be writing at the speed of turtley or extra turtley? This is where a Monte Carlo can come in handy. Well, it's about time that I start to zoom out here and reveal what I've been building in the background. This equation is the bedrock of the George R. R. Martin TWOW Monte Carlo Get Hype simulator. Well, what is a Monte Carlo calculator, though, you might ask? To read from Wikipedia, which has the easiest to understand definition, Monte Carlo experiments are a broad class of computational algorithms that rely on repeated random sampling to obtain numerical results. The underlying concept is to use randomness to solve problems that might be deterministic in principle. Monte Carlo methods are mainly used in 3 distinct problem classes: optimization, numerical integration, and generating draws from a probability distribution. They can also be used to model phenomena with significant uncertainty in inputs, such as calculating the risk of a nuclear power plant failure. Monte Carlo methods are often implemented using computer simulations, and they can provide approximate solutions to problems that are otherwise intractable or too complex to analyze mathematically. So you can see Monte Carlos all over at places where they give a person or a team a percentage chance to win. Places like 538 or whatever's left of it. If you haven't paid attention to the drama or don't know what it is or was, 538 was a website founded by Nate Silver that did statistical analyses on elections, sports, and culture, etc. Over the past 4 years, it has seen epic mismanagement, in my opinion, by ABC. ABC fired essentially their entire core staff at 538. Nate Silver left and took all of his models with him, and so then they turned around and replaced Nate Silver with his arch nemesis and digitally de-aged George Lucas, Elliot Morris. So now 538 isn't using the old models anymore, they're using Elliot Morris's. Wait, Morris, after all of those polls and that debate, and at the time that one candidate dropped because they figured that they didn't have any chance to win, you were still predicting 50-50? Oh, wow. Oh my god, how embarrassing. Anyway, Monte Carlos are very good for our purposes because they can replace what we don't know in between those values with randomness, in order to obtain a range of results to help us understand the likelihood of the book coming out at any moment in time. This will give us a graph of everything from the most optimistic of TWOW predictions, within a constraint of these parameters, all the way to the most pessimistic. In the end, what we get is a distribution, with a median giving us the most likely outcome given our currently available information. Is this outcome going to be the exact date TWOW will come out? No, that would be unlikely as picking a needle in a haystack. What? When I told you I could tell you when TWOW will finally release, I meant it, and I can. Just according to a statistical distribution that says that there are a lot of possibilities with some way more likely than others. Look, according to everything we have looked at, the date that we're about to find will be the most likely date around which TWOW will come out based on what data we publicly have available and is calculated by this model. It's just that there is going to be a large overall range of dates it could come out on because of the uncertainty in the model and information George has provided and what he will do in the future. How does this model work? A lot of it takes place behind the scenes and is programmed in Visual Basic, which allows you to write macros in Excel that are essentially stacking bespoke compound formulas that can be way more complicated than a typical Excel function. In practice, what happens is when I click this button here, it's going to run a number of iterations that I can request in this box up here. If I set it to 10, it will run this calculator 10 times and produce 10 unique possible outcomes for when the Winds of Winter might release. And each time it runs, it is going to randomly change its values based on the equation we did earlier. Bear in mind, electronic random number generators are not perfectly random, but that's neither here nor there. Starting with our page counts, I've set the model to randomly select a value between 1100 and 1200 each time it runs, and each time it runs a calculation, it will randomly select a new value for all of these constraints. Next is the date that TWOW was at those 1100 to 1200. We don't know if the October 22 date or the October 23 date is better. What this model does is it generates a date for each calculation between these two. With POVs remaining, it will randomly select either 18, 17, or 16. With close POVs, it will do the same, between 5 and 6. Will the book have an epilogue? Inquiring minds wonder. Fans are clamoring around the world to know when Patchface will finally have his day in the snow as the epilogue at the wall. If the book is high quality, it will have a Patchface POV. I gotta have more Patchface, baby. It will randomly choose a 50-50 chance between yes, there will be an epilogue, or no, there will not. When it calculates yes, it will seed the final page count with an additional chapter counted, which will be the length of the average pages per chapter. Speaking of the devil, the average pages per chapter is where it gets a bit more complicated. On the one hand, I could just set it to run this calculation we had from this formula, but there is a more explicit way to do this. The Get Hype simulator will randomly select one of these books based upon the probabilities in this chart, as well as apply a randomness factor to each based on the typical standard deviation, so that each iteration that the calculator uses is not exactly just one of these four figures. So instead of using the result of this calculation that would output whatever this result is, it's in the high 19s, it's 19.85. Instead of that being the page count every time this calculator runs, it will randomly select one of these four books to be the average page count per chapter on those probabilities below, and will also randomly distort it. But it will also be capped between the two end figures, so it can't go beyond 21.622 or lower than 14.9. And with our writing pages per year, it's going to use the 7.75 years and Fire and Blood manuscript pages to compute the low and the high bounds by altering the date and the pages from the unique random generation, then reseed the calculator with these low and high bounds, and then it's going to randomly select a point between these two bounds to generate George R. R. Martin's writing speed for that particular iterative trial. You get it? So all of this is going to operate in sequence. First, it's going to generate the pages and then the date, and then it's going to generate the low and the high bounds, and then it's going to generate a number between those two. So the low and the high bound are actually going to change every single time this calculator is run as well. By injecting so much randomness, we're going to get a good fair date for when the Winds of Winter will release. And each time this calculator runs and selects new values, it will then output the projected release date of that iteration into a bin down here that will hold hundreds of thousands of iterations of this calculator. Ergo, it will generate hundreds of thousands of potential release dates for the Winds of Winter, and what is left in the center will be statistically the most likely. Well, are you ready to run this? And yes, I have built a checker to make sure all the formulas and everything are computing properly. So for our final result, I'm going to set it to run for 100,000 iterations, which will be a good amount to get a fairly accurate statistical value, but it's also going to take many hours for this to run on the computer. So I'm going to set it and forget it, and I'll see you in a bit in the future. It is now time to finally calculate the Winds of Winter's most likely release date. And I think we're going to need at least a bit of theater for the reveal. He said it would be announced on his blog first, but he was wrong. It's going to be announced here, right now. I am very pleased to announce to you for the first time after all we've been through, the Winds of Winter's release date. All right, we're gonna have to have a talk. Our median lies on April 3rd of 2032, where half of all values fall to the left of this state and half fall to the right. Now don't be fooled by thinking because the peak is higher around 2029 that it really makes it more likely. It just means the mode is higher because those data points are compressed in time. Now that we've gotten the result, I know that this model is going to have its critics for various reasons. To just recap it, what is this model predicting and what is it saying? It's saying because Gurm has gone over his expected writing in 5 out of the 5 books so far in this series, every single one, his writing for this one should be similar to those. We saw the data from how he went over in the last one, from roughly the same point in time in the writing process. We came up with an algorithm based on that predicts he roughly needs about 1,000 manuscript pages to finish TWOW. And since he's written somewhere around 100 manuscript pages on average per year for the past decade, it'll take him about 10 years onwards from 2022 to finish the book. Sure, you could question that the last book might not be a perfect analog for TWOW. I understand that, and it's a fair critique. I'm not going to say outright that that's incorrect, because I don't know. We also don't have drafts like this from the first 3 books with predictions to back-check this algorithm against his priors. But despite that, it does line up with what we know from the historical trends, and I don't see any indication that this overall alignment would not continue. Like, sure, historical trends are not the end-all and be-all, but they're one of the best predictors, and if you're looking to predict a major deviation from them, it requires a substantial, solid piece of evidence, and I just don't see that out there. And we know when George writes more characters, he writes more in total. The last time he didn't have to split the book, he wrote the largest in the series, A Storm of Swords, with 1,521 pages. He had 10 regular POVs then. 10! Now he has 20. It's logical to assume he's gonna need a lot more than 1,700 to fit that in. And you know, there's a chance he might not stop at 20. I know he said that he isn't planning on adding more POVs, but if he gets stuck again, there's a non-zero chance it might have to happen. You can see it happening out in Marine with Another Knot, where George might have to add another POV to bring Dany and Tyrion together. People have also been stating it's a little questionable Marine doesn't have any native POVs. This is why I think there is a chance we might get the introduction of our first Lazarene POV. And I know the perfect character for a Lazarene. His name is Rem Lazar, who in traditional Myronese fashion is not to be confused by the healer sitting on the Targaryen small council, his brother, who is trying to help cure the plague outside the city, known of course as Remdesivir.
Please clap.
Now to the statisticians out there, I know that finding a static release date is not the best use of this model. There's an old saying in stats that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And in all honesty, I'm torn with the Charlie Kaufman problem, where I wanted to talk about this problem and build this model, but I also had to give people what they wanted, a release date. And while I understand the caveats of that, I do think it is still very useful in doing that when compared to its contemporary predictions that are out there. Plus, if your horizon is 8 years from the output of this model with this specific case and subject matter, it can tell you much of what you can learn without being perfect. For instance, if you're waiting for TWOW, the earliest date that this model will even produce is in September of 2026, and even so, that date requires everything to hit it. George to be the furthest currently along in 2022, the fewest pages remaining, and him writing as fast as the model allows. As a percentage, the chance of anything before 2028 is only 1%, and anything before 2029 is 8%. Again, if you're expecting TWOW in 2024, or 25, 26, or 27, I find those years to be pretty unlikely, if not probably statistically impossible. It's also important to keep in mind that this 2032 date from the model expects George R. Martin to increase his writing speed over his average of the past 10 years. If he doesn't, well then you'd be looking at something more like 2035. But if there's one thing that I really want you to take away from this whole 90-minute enterprise, it really isn't just that TWOW isn't coming out soon. It's how to think about a complicated problem in a certain way. Now, you don't have to come up with an elaborate formula and math or have massive amounts of data. You can, and you learn the math somewhere in life, so you've got the knowledge, you might as well use it. Just break the problem down, come up with a formula, look into what pieces you do have in historical trends, and you can probably sort out some sort of answer that's a better prediction than just blind guessing. And even if you feel that your gut predictions are accurate, it's a pretty good way to test them. Of course, this won't help with all of life's challenges, but it can help with some things. And I know this model raises about probably as many questions as it might potentially answer. What else can this model tell us about George R. R. Martin's length of the book, George R. R. Martin's writing speed, how fast he has been writing compared to his writing speeds before? What is the maximum speed that he could write? What sort of impact is A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms production going to have on TWOW? What difference does the largest length of TWOW in our model have versus the shortest? See, there's a larger analysis that can be done with this model now that it's been built, for sure, but I'm not sure that there's that much interest in seeing it. And of course, the obvious elephant in the room is if you're talking about a release date for The Winds of Winter in the 2030s, then is George R. R. Martin going to be able to complete The Winds of Winter within his lifetime? And look, I am no Gurmler, but if your horizon for the book's release is about 10 years from now, then those questions of longevity stop becoming stupid and start becoming data. And there are statistical measurements of that can be compared within this model, and it can tell you the probability that George R. R. Martin is going to be able to complete The Winds of Winter as the sole author. And what about the book being split? Now there's a spicy topic. What does this model say about A Dream of Spring? Yeah, there's enough here for a shorter follow-up sequel, if you would want it. So if you want it, do that thing you do, if you want to know more. And if so, I'll come out with a sequel within, the next 5 years. And to be serious for a second, I am grateful for you taking the time to listen to this. You know, I have no idea how this video is going to do metrics-wise. I did this out of passion because I wanted to make it and share it, and it's only starting to sink in now after months sunk into it that, as far as I know, this is considered a dead channel and nothing from it is ever going to get shared around on this platform again. So if you think some people would be interested in this, give it a like, an upvote elsewhere. Feel free to talk about it or share it with others who you think might be interested. I mean, I don't like doing these call to action things. I think people, if they like something, they'll probably do something regardless. But I probably really do need your bump more than most. So thank you. And that's all I've got, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and if there's one thing that I've learned from this whole ordeal more than anything, one final takeaway, and the definitive conclusion that everything has come to, they're never letting George R. R. Martin back on the pinball machine at Chuck E. Cheese.